Welcome to today's lecture. Today, we will be examining the extent to which Elizabeth had a productive relationship with her Privy Council. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. We will begin by examining Elizabeth's style of government and examine the roles of important ministers on her Privy Council. We will then study examples of when Elizabeth had productive relations with her Privy Council. After this, we will examine instances of paralysis, when Elizabeth stood in firm defiance against her Privy Council, and how this brought governance to a grinding halt. Finally, we will examine how the strong relations within the Privy Council unravelled in the final decade of Elizabeth's reign, and how this resulted in factionalism. For the most part, Elizabeth utilised her Privy Council in what was a conciliar form of government. Her sister had appointed between 40 and 50 Privy Councillors at any one time, and this had made the council unwieldy. It also meant that it was easily dominated by key personalities, such as Stephen Gardiner. Elizabeth therefore reduced the number to approximately 20 councillors. These councillors mainly came from the upper gentry and lesser nobility, including some experienced ministers from her brother Edward's reign. However, very few of these had been part of Mary's Privy Council. The notable exception was William Cecil. Overall, Elizabeth's Privy Council represented men of both merit and good social standing. However, she excluded many members of the traditional nobility and high-ranking prelates, or bishops. This is mainly because these two elite groups had been the strongest supporters of Mary's restoration of the Catholic faith. However, it did also mark a further shift towards a more modern style of government, whereby a man's education and professional skills mattered as much as their social status. Having said this, Elizabeth still relied on some more than others. She had an inner circle of ministers, with William Cecil acting as Elizabeth's chief minister for nearly 4 decades. Historian Susan Doran describes how this inner circle acted as a cohesive body that shared a common Calvinist approach to the Anglican faith, and this meant they were often united in other policies, such as foreign intervention in the Netherlands and the handling of Mary Queen of Scots. Despite this broad consensus between ministers, this did not always result in the smooth running of government. This is because Elizabeth would often use her royal prerogative to resist their advice, and this would result in a standoff between Queen and councillors. Let's now examine key individuals on Elizabeth's Privy Council. Elizabeth's chief minister and closest confidant was William Cecil, who was appointed to the Privy Council in November 1558 and retained his position until close to his death in 1598. This meant that Cecil was the longest-standing chief minister of the Tudor age, and his moderate approach brought stability to Elizabeth's government after the turbulent decades of the mid-Tudor crisis. During his tenure, Cecil took on various roles, firstly as Secretary of State in 1558, and then in 1572 as Lord Treasurer, before later becoming the Lord Privy Seal. In this sense, there hadn't been a minister who had worked across as many departments of government since Thomas Wolsey. Unlike Wolsey, Cecil did not have a large ego and a great thirst for power. He was capable of standing up to Elizabeth when he disagreed with her, and on several occasions, he threatened to resign if she did not act upon his advice. By the 1590s, his age resulted in a slow decline in his health. During this time, he worked closely with his son Robert to hand over the ministerial reins. The second most notable minister was Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's childhood friend and possible sweetheart. He was not only a member of the Privy Council, but also the Queen's favourite for 3 decades. He had a troubled past, however, as a member of the notorious Dudley family. His grandfather, his father, and his brother had all been executed for treason. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, who had been the Lord President for Edward's Council after committing a coup d'état against the Duke of Somerset. Following Northumberland's failed attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, Robert Dudley had been placed in the Tower of London on suspicion of treason. Nonetheless, Elizabeth trusted Dudley due to the connection they had made in their adolescence. Cecil had his reservations about placing Dudley on the Privy Council, but on the whole they worked well and usually agreed on matters. The main difference between the two was that Dudley was more sympathetic to the Puritan cause, since, as the son of Northumberland, he had a staunchly Calvinist viewpoint. Furthermore, it was Dudley who most pushed for military intervention in the Netherlands during the 1570s and early 80s. This led to him eventually leading a campaign to the Netherlands following the Treaty of Nonsuch in 1585, a disastrous end to what had otherwise been a strong political career. He died less than a year after returning to England. Sir Francis Walsingham is arguably the most interesting of Elizabeth's Privy Councillors. This is because he was the famous spy master who ran a web of informants both in England and abroad to flush out traitors as part of the Catholic threat. This included seminary priests, Jesuits and, of course, the key players implicated in the plots to place Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. Walsingham was an unlikely candidate for Privy Councillor since the son of a lawyer, and had built up his reputation in espionage on the continent. However, like Dudley and Cecil, he was a committed Protestant and had a particularly useful expertise. His success as Elizabeth's spymaster earned him prestige. He was knighted in 1577 and acted as Secretary of State from 1573 until his death in 1590. Whilst most of the council were committed Protestants, the highest-ranking member was the exception. Thomas Howard, the fourth Duke of Norfolk, was a conservative who continued to privately practice his Catholic faith. He was the grandson of the Duke of Norfolk who had led the conservative faction during Henry's reign, and as a result had been imprisoned in the Tower for most of Edward's reign. Despite this, he was Elizabeth's closest blood relative, since her mother Anne Boleyn had been the niece of his father. This helps to explain why Elizabeth chose to allocate him a place on the Privy Council, especially since she wanted to hear from both Catholics and Protestants when devising the middle way of the Elizabethan settlement. Her loyalty was misplaced, however. Norfolk betrayed her by becoming implicated in both the Northern Rebellion and the Ridolfi plot. On both occasions, he made a power play to marry Mary Queen of Scots. As a result, he was executed for treason in 1572. Let's now examine the key successes of the Privy Council, which supports the notion that they acted as a like-minded and cohesive political body. The best example of this can be found at the very start of Elizabeth's reign with the creation of the Elizabethan settlement. This was the priority policy once Elizabeth had succeeded the throne, and over those first few months the Privy Council worked alongside Elizabeth to create a framework for the new Anglican Church. This resulted in the swift passing of two key pieces of legislation, the Act of Supremacy and Act of Uniformity, both passed in February 1559. It is also an example of when Elizabeth and key members of her Privy Council were able to achieve a compromise, since Elizabeth was keen to keep key ceremonial aspects of the Catholic faith, whilst her Privy Council pushed for a church based on Calvinist principles. Another key success was the financial management of the country by the Privy Council. Elizabeth inherited an impoverished treasury, caused by and large by her father's debasement of the coinage and expensive French campaign in the 1540s, and so the Privy Council worked well together to manage royal finance and increase revenue from traditional sources such as crown lands. They also kept court expenditure as low as they could, without taking away any of the pageantry or majesty of Elizabeth's image. The Privy Council were united in their commitment to the defence of English shores. This is because at the start of Elizabeth's reign, she faced a potential invasion from France, both over the Channel Sea and over the border from Scotland. Later, England also faced the rising threat from Spain, which accumulated in the 1588 Spanish Armada. This meant that money was invested in the navy and coastal defences of England. Elizabeth's main foreign policy aim was security, and therefore she was in full support of this. To fund this, both leading Privy Councillors and Elizabeth invested in privateering, the practice of legal piracy against Spanish galleons, resulting in the looting of treasure from the New World. As a result, England was able to effectively defend her shores during the Anglo-Spanish War from 1588 to 1603. They also grew in prestige as a naval power, laying the foundations for imperial expansion in the Jacobean Age. The final example of the Privy Council working in a productive and cohesive way is through social reform measures. Throughout the second half of the 16th century, poverty and the wealth divide grew as a result of changes in agricultural practices and the growth of the urban economy. This resulted in vagrancy as the rural poor searched for work, then took to begging. Edward's Regency Council had dealt with this in a punitive way, through branding and whipping the victims. However, Elizabeth's Privy Council had a more progressive approach. They introduced various measures that would provide support for those deemed the poor, in other words those who through injury, illness or age could not find work. This accumulated in the 1601 Poor Law that established the modern welfare state. The Privy Council also had a strong relationship with Parliament. This is because many councillors attended sessions in the Commons or the Lords to ensure that important laws were passed. This meant that Parliament never refused a parliamentary subsidy, even during the times of high inflation in the 1590s. However, at times, Parliament would unite with leading members of the Privy Council with their views on a policy against the Queen and her wishes. Let's now examine the times when Elizabeth stood in defiance against her Privy Council. Like her father, Elizabeth was hot-tempered and principled. As a result, she could be incredibly stubborn. She strongly believed in her own divine right to make the final decision, and as part of this she would use her royal prerogative to override the decisions of her council. This would sometimes lead to months of paralysis as Elizabeth dug in her heels and resisted the calls of her Privy Council to act upon something. As a result, some historians argue that Elizabeth's reign was one of inaction and waiting for important decisions to be made. The most notable example of this paralysis came with the question of marriage and the succession. Elizabeth strongly believed that both these matters were a matter of royal prerogative, and that it was not the role of the Privy Council to do any more than provide advice. In 1558, the Privy Council had assumed Elizabeth would marry a foreign prince, ideally of the Protestant faith, within the first few years. However, despite being presented with viable candidates, Elizabeth chose not to marry. This frustrated her Privy Council, especially William Cecil, who continued to put candidates forward until the mid-1570s, when it was clear that she had gone beyond childbearing age. Even once it was clear that Elizabeth would not bear her own child, she refused to name a successor. This wasn't such a pressing issue until Elizabeth advanced in age. Even in her final year of life, she resolutely refused, resulting in Robert Cecil having to go behind her back to correspond with James to ensure a smooth succession. The second issue that caused friction between Elizabeth and her Privy Council was the Protestant cause abroad. England was the most powerful Protestant nation at the height of the European Reformation. During her reign, there were religious civil wars firstly in Scotland, and then in France and the Netherlands. As a result, her Privy Council persistently called for her to aid the Protestant cause abroad. They believed that if the Huguenots in France or the Dutch rebels in the Netherlands were to emerge victorious, this would bolster England's security, but that this could only be achieved through foreign aid. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was reluctant to commit English troops to a foreign campaign. In 1560, Cecil had to threaten to resign in order for her to send troops north to help the Scottish Calvinists, and it took until the 1585 Treaty of Nonsuch for Elizabeth to finally agree to an English campaign in the Netherlands. Some historians use this as evidence that Elizabeth was an indecisive and inconsistent monarch. Others see her stubbornness as a strength. She would not be easily swayed by her councillors toward a foreign policy that could result in financial ruin. Finally, the Privy Council united with MPs in Parliament against the Queen on the matter of Mary, Queen of Scots. Since her arrival in England in 1568, Mary had been placed under house arrest in the stately homes of trusted Protestant courtiers. However, following the Ridolfi plot of 1571, members of the Privy Council made calls for her execution. Elizabeth resisted these calls for 16 years, and the calls only grew louder. By the mid-1580s, the issue had escalated to the point whereby Parliament had joined their voices to the plea. Mary was implicated in the Babington plot and found guilty in a trial in October 1586. But it took another 5 months for Cecil and his fellow councillors to persuade Elizabeth to sign her death warrant. As a result, this is the most heightened example of the paralysis between council and queen. Let's now examine key individuals on Elizabeth's Privy Council. Elizabeth's chief minister and closest confidant was William Cecil, who was appointed to the Privy Council in November 1558 and retained his position until close to his death in 1598. This meant that Cecil was the longest-standing chief minister of the Tudor age, and his moderate approach brought stability to Elizabeth's government after the turbulent decades of the mid-Tudor crisis. During his tenure, Cecil took on various roles, firstly as Secretary of State in 1558, and then in 1572 as Lord Treasurer, before later becoming the Lord Privy Seal. In this sense, there hadn't been a minister who had worked across as many departments of government since Thomas Wolsey. Unlike Wolsey, Cecil did not have a large ego and a great thirst for power. He was capable of standing up to Elizabeth when he disagreed with her, and on several occasions, he threatened to resign if she did not act upon his advice. From 1590, William Cecil's health was failing him. As such, he delegated many of his responsibilities to his son Robert. Like his father, Robert Cecil was competent and moderate in his approach, but his elevation resulted in jealousy from others at court. After his father died in 1596, he assumed his father's role as chief minister, officially appointed as the Secretary of State, but received resistance from other courtiers. Robert Cecil's main rival was a childhood friend called Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was the godson and stepson of Robert Dudley, and took his stepfather's position as the Queen's favourite from 1587 onwards. Since his father had died when Essex was underage, he'd spent a large portion of his childhood as a ward to the Cecil family. He was also married to Walsingham's daughter, making him very well connected at court. He was a hot-headed character with a willful personality, and this, alongside his handsome looks, explains why Elizabeth was enamored by him. He gathered a group of courtiers around him, some of whom were notable Renaissance writers like Philip Sidney and Francis Bacon. However, Essex also attracted enemies, especially given the Queen's patronage. For example, he was granted a monopoly for sweet wine that meant he was the only person allowed to import and sell this luxury item, making him a lot of profit. Historians have made much of the personal rivalry between Cecil and Essex as evidence of factionalism at Elizabeth's court during the 1590s. They have used this as evidence that the stability and cohesion of Elizabeth's government had dismantled, and in her advanced age, Elizabeth was hoodwinked by Essex's charms, which led to him gaining too much influence over her. Essex faced a sharp decline from favour, however, after he fouled up as the military commander during the Irish campaign of 1599. He also supposedly marched into the Queen's quarters, armed with a sword, to beg for her favour, before she was dressed. Essex was put on trial for his rash behaviour on his return to Ireland. As a consequence, he was stripped of his official positions and his monopoly of sweet wine. As a result, Essex became even more resentful of Cecil's position as the Queen's chief minister. The following year, in 1601, Essex attempted to overthrow Cecil as Elizabeth's chief minister. It is known as the Essex Rebellion, but by Tudor standards, it was far too small to call a rebellion, and is better categorised as a revolt. Essex fortified his townhouse on the Strand in London, and then gathered 300 supporters and marched through the streets of London. He hoped to rally the townspeople to his cause, claiming that Elizabeth was besieged by evil ministers and that Cecil was a traitor to the realm. The townsfolk did not rally to his cause, however, and after the royal guard created a barricade at Ludgate, he was forced to retreat to Essex home, where he was eventually arrested. He was put on trial, where he made wild accusations against Cecil, before finally being executed for high treason. The Essex Rebellion was a pitiful affair and darkened the final years of Elizabeth's reign, whose spirit was broken by the betrayal of the young man who had brought her such youthful joy in her old age. However, following Essex's execution, Robert Cecil faced no political opposition, and this allowed him to focus on the succession. Elizabeth resolutely refused to name a successor, but the most viable candidate was James VI of Scotland, the Protestant son of Mary Queen of Scots. Therefore, in the final year of Elizabeth's life, Cecil began secret correspondence with James to smooth the succession. The gamble paid off, as James allowed him to retain the position of Secretary of State on his ascension to the crown. He was then elevated to the Earl of Salisbury in 1605, and he would retain the position of Chief Minister until his death in 1612. Let's now return to our overarching question of, to what extent did Elizabeth have a productive relationship with her Privy Council? Firstly, it is worth remembering that there was consistency across nearly 4 decades due to Elizabeth's long-serving ministers, most notably William Cecil, which helped to bring stability to Elizabeth's reign following the turbulence of the mid-Tudor years. For the first 2 decades of Elizabeth's reign, relations between monarch and Privy Councillors was largely harmonious. There was a Protestant consensus between the Privy Councillors so that they could make strong decisions. The most notable example of this being the Elizabethan settlement that brought moderation in establishing the Anglican Church. However, there were key issues where Elizabeth clashed with her Privy Council, and this often led to paralysis in government, especially in the latter half of her reign. The most notable example was when Elizabeth very nearly refused to sign Mary's death warrant in 1587, despite nearly 2 decades of pleading from her Privy Council. Finally, the final decade of Elizabeth's reign saw a deterioration in good relations between members of the Privy Council. This is mainly due to the rivalry between the Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, and the Queen's favourite, Robert Devereux. Despite the high drama of the 1601 Essex Rebellion, the Privy Council did continue to function effectively. This is best shown by how Robert Cecil was able to prepare for the smooth succession of James in 1603, despite Elizabeth refusing to name him as her heir. Thank you for listening. Tune in to my next lecture to learn about Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament.